Well, welcome to question 66 of the Secundae. This topic is theft and robbery, and I am Dr. Thibault. Just to put this into context, we were dealing with the issue of justice. We were looking at commutative justice, which is the justice between individuals within a society, rather than distributive justice, which is the part to the whole. So we are looking at the relationship between individuals within society and the challenges to justice that are found therein. We've already covered murder in question 64, and in 65, we looked at maiming and striking and hitting people and imprisoning people. So now we're looking at theft and robbery. Next, we will be looking at justice of a judge. But looking at theft and robbery, we're dealing with these two compared to the previous ones, which all really dealt with the person, right? How does that affect the person through violence and lack of freedom? Now we're looking at property and the nature of taking another person's property. Question 66. Um, Ownership of property is one of the first questions. Is there even ownership of property, private property? As if nobody owns something, then you can't really steal it, can you? So one of the first lines of the Contra is "Thou shalt not steal." Therefore, since Scripture says "Thou shalt not steal," then there must be property, private property. But St. Thomas, of course, goes into much more detail in his answer. He says, "Well, external things, property, kind of exist in two different ways when we talk about ownership of property. First is by their very nature, and property by their very nature, uh, the power of which comes from God alone. So, since God's creator of everything, therefore God is really by nature the owner of everything. So, in that regard, is somewhat like the objectors to the idea of personal property. How can you own anything if God owns it all? So, in terms of nature, you can't. Everything belongs to God according to its nature. But the second way in which somebody could own something is by their use. Uh, so, in that regard, God doesn't really need to use anything. God might be the owner of it all by nature, but God doesn't actually use it. And why did God even create it? Well, it was for man's natural dominion. Um, and this is kind of an interesting logic in here. It says God made man's body dependent on subsistence. Therefore, God gives man authority over matters of subsistence. So, because human beings need food to eat and water to drink and shelter to stay out of the elements and clothing to cover us out of modesty and to keep us away from the elements, protect us from the cold and the heat. Um, because the certain nature of the things that we need to survive as human beings, right? In order to have the mass, we need to have an altar. We need to have wine and bread and books, unless they're all memorized. There are certain things that are useful, which leads us to greater holiness. Um, well, we can use all of this to lead us to that greater holiness. We can use it both just for our pure animal survival and also to uh, to serve God and neighbor. That's why the world exists. Therefore, uh, man has natural dominion over it, not ownership by nature, but ownership by use. And this has been set out by divine command. So even though God might own it all, He has given it to us for our use for a particular purpose. Uh, uh, Kind of an interesting line that the rich man sins by considering that his wealth belongs to him principally and not as a gift from God, which is a great line from the Contras. Um, this idea that even if it is given to us for our use, the idea that it's just mine, I can do whatever I want with it, is not in line with St. Thomas's thinking. Excuse me. I had to plug in the computer. Um, but no person truly owns anything. Everything is, to some degree, God's. If this wealth and the goods of this earth are for our use, it's not for our use to the exclusion of the good of our neighbor, but with the good of our neighbor, we share the goods of this world. There's different reasons which were given for private property. So St. Thomas says in Article 2 that people have the power to procure and to dispense of private property. And he has three reasons why this should be allowed. It says people are better at getting what they need for themselves than other people are. If I try to give what my neighbor needs and my neighbor tries to give me what I need, they might not know what I need and I might not know what my neighbor needs. So out of practicality, it's much more practical for me to procure and dispense of my own needs than it is for my neighbor to dispense of my own needs. I suppose in a very tight-knit community like a monastery, you can do this. If anybody's been in a monastery and been at silent meals, the ideal is that you should know your neighbor well enough to know what they need before they know what they need themselves. If you know that your person sitting next to you likes to put salt on their potatoes, if you see there's potatoes today, you should already know and be thinking, I need to get them their salt without them ever asking for it. Well, that does work in a very limited way within a monastic community. It's a little bit harder when you're dealing with a society and you're dealing with national policies and things like this. So it's in a very practical way, in a larger scale, it's much easier for people to get what they need for themselves. He also said it's much more orderly to procure for yourself what you need. It's just much more efficient again. In some ways, it's similar. It's saying a similar thing, but it's saying it's much more orderly to do it that way. There's chaos in the terms of everybody trying to meet everybody else's needs. Well, how do you know that you're not going to forget someone, or how is this going to work? That would be a very complicated system if everybody was trying to reach everybody else's needs without any concern for their own. And lastly, he points out, just as another matter of practicality, that these societies with private property seem to create a much more peaceful state. There's less quarreling when you're responsible for yourself. If your neighbor is responsible for you and they don't meet your needs, then it begins a fight. And part of that it could be that not everybody desires the same thing. Not everybody needs the same thing. There's some people who like to live very simply, and there's some people who like to live rather extravagantly. If you live very simply, you might not understand the desires of a person who likes more sophisticated things, I guess. And if you're a person who likes more fancy things, you might not understand somebody who is very simple. You might keep on giving the simple person these things that they have no interest in. So it creates fighting, it creates quarreling, it's disordered, it doesn't meet everyone's needs in the most efficient way. So for those reasons, St. Thomas says private property is just much more practical. In terms of their use, he says this is also more practical. And some of the opposition says there should be no private property, that all things should be common property since all of it belongs to God. And he says man ought to possess external things not as his own, but as common, so that he is ready to communicate them to others in their need. So a person should have the private property. A person should acquire private property. They should procure it and dispense of private property. It's very useful to have private property. But in the back of their mind, they should have in mind that this is common as well. And that why do you have more than you need to survive for today? Well, because you can use it to help other people who don't have it. So it is privately owned for communal use, is the ultimate end of it. Um, it helps us to meet the needs of others. If we don't have enough for ourselves, then we can't help others, right? The idea of having more than we need. Why have it? Why start a business and become a millionaire? Well, because as a millionaire, you're able to do tremendous more good in the world. Hopefully, that's the idea. Unless you hoard it and then you never use it for anyone's good, then it's not so good. So it's all a matter of how is it used. So again, I know being fairly repetitious, but you should have the private property and you should have the mindset that private property is for the good of all, not just for your own personal desires. One of these heavily quoted lines, St. Basil and St. Ambrose are heavily quoted throughout this question, is why are you rich while another is poor? Unless it be that you may have the merit of good stewardship, and that he the reward of patience. So what is in this difference? Why are some poor and some rich within society? What is the bigger divine nature to any of these issues? Well, God is using these things in order to bring upon us our own sanctification in some regard. So, if God has gifted you with the generosity of having a tremendous amount of wealth, He is testing our virtue. He is building our virtue in generosity. Because we have more, we have to now practice generosity. If we don't practice generosity, then we have fallen short and we are living in sin and vice. What is in it for the poor? Well, the poor learned also to have this generosity, the recipient of generosity, and the poor is called to be patient in receiving this gifts. So both sides are tested in their ability to have their needs met. There's a challenge in there. It reminds me of the story of Martin de Tours, where it's in the encounter with the 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 naked Christ, the homeless Christ, that Martin, but when being generous, encounters Christ. So what's in it for the rich? A chance to encounter Christ. Um, What's in it for the poor? A chance to encounter the generosity of Christ through your brothers and sisters. So in both senses, it is an ability to encounter Christ in that exchange between the haves and the have-nots when done well. We don't live in a world where everything is done well, either on the side of the poor or on the side of the rich. He then talks about in Article 4 the essence of theft. There's three things in theft, which, as an American lawyer, I can see the American law system very similar in the ways that it looks at the elements of a crime. Similarly, St. Thomas sets out the elements of crime. So this goes back a long time. It takes the belongings which belong to another. It takes it into their own possession to the exclusion of the other. The person who is owed it by justice isn't allowed to possess it. And the thing is taken in secret. And the secret part is St. Thomas finds very interesting, and he uses St. Isidore of Seville to discuss this. So he says that theft, which is in Latin the fur is derived from furvus, and so from fuscus, which means dark, which means the ability to take advantage of another at night because of the darkness involved with theft. So theft, right in its very name, has the idea of darkness and hiddenness, secretness. Um, he also then, in Article 5, talks about theft is sinful on two accounts. In that, first, it opposes justice, right? It takes something which justly belongs to another and is now injustice. It's a commutation, if we go back a couple questions. It also has guile and fraud or fraud involved in it, so that it lays hands on another's properly, secretly and cunningly. So it is, in some ways, it's two vices put into one. One in that it opposes justice, and two that it has a cunningness and guileless in order to deprive the person of justice. So there's two sins in the one sin of theft. He also then compares theft to robbery. Say, are they the same thing? And this comes up later on as well in future questions. But both are, he considers, involuntary commutations. Both of them are a taking of your neighbor through involuntary means. A person who does it through robbery does it through violence and openly. They openly take from somebody. And theft is done through ignorance, because it's done secretly. You think you have all your money in your bank, and then all of a sudden you go to make a purchase, and it turns out you don't. Right? So it's ignorance that has done you in, through being taken secretly. There's always an element of surprise when you find out that you've been robbed. You've been thieved. So So the question is, are they of the same species? St. Thomas says, no, they're not of the same species. The sin of the aspect of robbery differs from that of theft. Both are depriving the neighbor of their belongings, but one does it through force and another through cunning. So both of them have this added level of sin, other than just just how they've taken it is one more element of the sin. He also then, in Article 9, the last of the articles in question 66, says robbery is more grievous than sin, although one may be more embarrassed by being deceived through ignorance. Being robbed at knife point or through the threat of violence is more grievous, right? Something could go wrong and you could be killed over this scenario under robbery, versus under theft. There's no chance of you being accidentally killed in the matter. You don't even realize it happened when it's happened. So is theft a mortal sin? Which is an interesting question. He said the great command is to love God and love the neighbor, and this is violated if one steals from one's neighbor. So it violates charity when you steal from your neighbor. That even small stealing, if one does it habitually, if everyone is doing it habitually, it would lead to the breakdown of society. If everyone's just stealing from one another, even if we think it's a fairly small thing, it eventually there's no such thing as private property anymore, and society ends in chaos, and then it has a mortal effect to it because of the impacts on society if it were to occur on a popular big case. You can't help but think, though, and St. Thomas points it out, how about very small things? He says, how about like a needle or a quill? Quill being for modern day, we would have a pen. What if you were over at your friend's house and you accidentally stole their pen? Or what if you intentionally stole their pen? Are you damned to hell because you have a mortal sin because you've stolen this pen from your neighbor? And he said, well, if you did it intentionally to violate charity, then yes, right? If you said, I'm going to steal his pen, uh, well, then yeah, it kind of is, even though it's a very small thing, if you did it, if you do a small thing with great love, it's a great gift. If you do a small thing with against great love, it's also a terrible thing. Says, well, if it's so small that you can, the nature of your friend, you can presume that they would have given it to you anyway if you just asked, and it was more a matter of laziness than anything. Then it's not a mortal sin, right? You won't, if you're going into the office and the secretary has some candy on the desk and you don't ask permission before you take an M&M, you don't go to hell for stealing an M&M if you can presume that the purpose of her having it on her desk was to give it way, it would have been polite if you asked, but if she wasn't at her desk, for example, and you still took it, you can presume that if she was at the desk and you could have asked, she would have said yes. Uh, that would be different than her pocketbook or her shoes or her computer, any other personal effect. But if it's a small thing and you can presume that they would have said yes, then it wouldn't be mortal. Whether it would be a sin or not, maybe we don't quite know according to St. Thomas. I guess it might depend on the nature of the relationship and the object taken. How about the kind of famous question of if stealing is really sinful, if it is made to meet a necessity? What if a person starving to death steals a loaf of bread, for example? The Jean Valjean case from Les Miserables. Um, and this one, St. Thomas is kind of clear on. He says, in this case of need, all things are common property. There is not only is it not a mortal sin, no sin exists. So, in case of necessity, all property becomes common property. He does say it would be better if the just man who has extra were given the opportunity to give it freely to the poor. But if necessity requires it, then the poor man may just take it. And he could take it openly or secretly. That doesn't quite matter. Um, Quoting St. Ambrose, he says, "It is the hungry man's bread that you withhold, the naked man's cloak that you store away. The money that you bury in the earth is the price of the poor man's ransom and freedom." And later on, he says, "He who spends too much is a robber." If you are extravagant in your spending on luxury goods, you are stealing from the necessity of the poor. Um, uh, Perhaps hard to see in the United States too much, but if you can imagine how many people could be saved overseas with mosquito nets or very simple vaccines, um, you know, is that $500 handbag stealing from orphan children in Haiti, for example? Well, St. Ambrose tends to think so, and St. Thomas seems to agree. So it's a little bit of a challenge to people who have the mindset that their money is theirs and they can do whatever they want with it. Well, St. Thomas would say not necessarily and not entirely. The the opposite, my pushback, and it's difficult to know when you should just report what is being said and when you should try to give your own personal feedback. And I tried to not give my own personal feedback too much, but I think that this is a difficult one in the modern day. It probably was always a difficult one, but um, so let's say the person receives public assistance of some kind, um, and they spend the money on drugs and alcohol, or stick with drugs and alcohol, or gambling, right? Some of the common addictions. Um, the person gambles away their money, they drink their money, they shoot up their money. Uh, do they have a right then just to break into our houses and steal our silverware, to pawn it off, to buy more, to buy food, because they used all the money that they had for food on their vice? Uh, that's a tough one. Uh, I think it's a tough one. I think that's a tough one because how do you? Yeah, maybe they really do need it for food, but if maybe the reason they need it for food is because they spent the money they did have on something else. So there's always a matter of choice in this. So I think St. Thomas, he's really talking about a time and a place where people are just really just down and out. It's the widow and the orphan. It's the Jean Valjean situation. Um, how much of that exists within the first world today? Probably not as much. You know, there are a lot of public programs which would then make it so that one doesn't have to steal in order to survive. All right, because we're really talking about survival. It's not I get to steal the Xbox because I don't have an Xbox. It doesn't really work that way. What we're talking about is necessities. So I think perhaps outside of the United States that it might be possible, but it's probably pretty improbable in the United States. Um, St. Thomas didn't talk about it, but the food pantry is available. You should go to the food pantry rather than stealing if you have options. I'm not sure people always had options at the time that the Summa was written. Certainly not at the time that Ambrose was around. Um, the next question, Article 8, which is they only have it 9 articles, and we already did the ninth article a couple slides back. Is it lawful to steal? Well, quite obviously, no. It's not lawful to steal, but then it somewhat depends on how you define stealing. So, St. Thomas even writes in the beginning, he calls it robbery. Is it ever lawful to rob um, something? Um, and he says, no, but there's situations which might seem like it. So, like if there was a just war and the winning side has spoils of war, uh, do you need to give reparations for the spoils of war? And he says, no, not if it's a just war, and not if the spoils were uh, adequately or appropriately taken. Uh, if somebody is only waging war in order to get the spoils of war, then that's not a just war, right? So the caveat is that if it is a just war and is just spoils of war, which is what goes to pay for the war in the ancient times, then yes, you could do that, and that's not stealing; it's the spoils of war, which is allowed. Um, if somebody takes something through order of the court or public authority, then it's not robbery. So if the sheriff comes to your house to help repossess your apartment because you didn't pay your rent, well, that's not a robbery. It's been done through the public system and the court of law. The prince has granted that right to take back the property because you didn't pay your bills. So that's not, or steal things or whatever the reason is that you violated the public trust in the public common good is by the appropriate authorities have granted permission to take it, then it's not robbery. And lastly, to the dismay of libertarians, some libertarians out there, taxes is not robbery. So if the prince requires you to pay a certain tax, um, to pay for the maintenance of the state, the upkeep of the state, so long as it is an appropriate tax, appropriately used for the good of the common good, well, then that's not robbery, that's taxes. So that's the last part of that. So in conclusion, just to briefly summarize this, there was 9 articles, but a lot of them there was overlap. There's we call it the nature of private property. We differentiated between theft and robbery. We looked at the degree of sin associated with theft, all the way from a mortal sin to not a sin at all. Uh, and we looked at stealing in various cases where we wouldn't call it stealing because it's allowed according to the common good and the public authorities. Uh, that's all we have for this time. Um, we'll then next time move on to the issue of unjust judges. Should be interesting. Still on the issue of commutative justice.